One of my first music theory professors said Mozart wrote the music that everyone knew, but no one had written down. He was exaggerating, of course. All of Mozart's music is his own, but it's so elegant and organic that it seems almost obvious, inevitable.
And what's amazing is that he creates this sense of inevitability and expectation and irony without relying on any external narratives. Musicologists call this absolute music because it doesn't involve any extra musical programs or associations. It isn't explicitly about anything. But in the 21st century, we aren't always used to dealing with absolute music. We're conditioned to digest music by asking, what's it about, or what's the story? Because when you hear a song on the radio, those questions are pretty easy to answer. But that approach doesn't really work with absolute music. And I think that's why I hear people complain, I don't get it, when listening to classical music, or say they're not smart enough to understand it. Well, it's actually not about intelligence at all. It's just about adjusting the way we listen to absolute music. In a sense, I'm calling for a more abstract approach to listening, one without the aid of external stories or programs. But in another way, it's actually a much more direct way of engaging with the music, because it forces us to respond to musical events themselves instead of letting them stand in for something else. Why is this important? Well, it breeds thinking that is nuanced and creative, both abstract and specific. But moreover, it gives all of us unrestricted access to some of the greatest and most fundamentally human music ever created, because great music rewards great listening. And I want to challenge the stereotype that classical music is only for an elite few. So to explain it, I'm going to use the most relatable, accessible art form I can think of, the 90s TV show Seinfeld. Now, the absence of plot doesn't mean the narrative elements are any less vivid. Seinfeld, the self-proclaimed show about nothing, isn't about the plot either. What I think makes Seinfeld and Mozart and Haydn so great is how elegantly their large-scale structures respond to their internal conflicts. What I mean is that both show and music present some kind of initial conflict, an inciting incident that is worked out over the course of the movement or episode, and is so essential to its dramatic identity that the work can only come to rest when that conflict is ultimately addressed. The music scholar Charles Rosen explained it this way in describing the works of Haydn. He wrote, "They express an immediate conflict, and the full play and resolution of the conflict is the work." And so, whether in music or in sitcom, dramatic development is a function of the managing of expectations. So before we get into Seinfeld, I want to take a minute to introduce the language of expectations in classical music. Let's listen to the opening of this B minor string quartet by Haydn. Okay, so already in the first measure, we have an issue. This quartet is supposed to be in B minor, but that opening doesn't sound very minor. It actually begins in D major, which shares 2 out of 3 notes with B minor, but has a much sunnier color. Here's a B minor chord. And now listen to the opening one more time. It's not until here that we even get the suggestion of B minor. But Haydn really goes out of his way to delay the arrival of that home key. And he doesn't actually give it to us until 11 bars into the piece. There, we finally get to the B minor we've been waiting for. That was only the first phrase of the piece, and it's already demonstrated a fundamental tonal ambiguity, a blurring of the lines between B minor and D major. And that fundamental problem doesn't just go away. It continues to shape the whole structure of the piece. After this first theme you've just heard, movements like this usually move to a new key and present a contrasting theme. So let's hear that second theme. Does that sound familiar? The violin is actually playing the exact same notes that opened the piece, only this time it's harmonized firmly in D major by the parts below. Haydn's genius is not only in crafting a theme that works equally well in B minor and D major, but in recasting it here where we expect a new theme, and thereby acknowledging the false tonal opening of the piece and the first theme's propensity to sound like B minor, to sound like D major instead of B minor, kind of like calling his own bluff. If we return to Charles Rosen's way of listening, we can hear how Haydn's second theme carries out the tonal conflict latent in his first theme. So even while Haydn's playing with our expectations, the blueprint for the large-scale organization of the piece is actually right there on display in the design of the opening material. For another comparison, I'll use Mozart's G major string quartet and the Seinfeld episode, The Marine Biologist, as case studies. Here's where the principal issues are introduced in The Marine Biologist.
Hey, did you see that whale thing on TV last night?
No.
I am such a huge whale fan. These marine biologists were showing how they communicate with each other with the squeaks and the squeals. What a fish.
It's a mammal.
Whatever.
And then Kramer enters.
Right now, there are 600 Titleists that I got from the driving range in the trunk of my car. Why don't we drive out to Rockaway and hit them into the ocean?
So George doesn't really know anything about whales, and Kramer wants to golf at the beach. They're not exactly problems yet, but because of Seinfeld's narrative economy, we know they'll be important. Now let's take a look at Mozart. Here's the first phrase. Now that's a balanced, symmetrical, 8-measure phrase, but that's not actually what Mozart wrote. Listen specifically to the cello in the last 2 bars. You hear the cello leap down from D to G to resolve the phrase in G major, as we would expect. Now pay attention to the cello again and listen to what Mozart actually wrote. Instead of leaping down to G major, Mozart has the cello sliding up by half steps to create an E minor chord above it. We call that a deceptive resolution because it subverts our expectations by frustrating the natural resolution and allows Mozart to extend the phrase by 2 bars to correct this deformity. And there's another weird thing going on in this first phrase, and that's Mozart's dynamic micromanaging, the way he kind of obsessively messes with the volume. Listen one more time. It creates a weird kind of seasick effect, sort of like turning the volume knob up and down on the radio. Like those issues introduced in the beginning of the Seinfeld episode, there's nothing inherently wrong with deceptive resolutions and dynamic contrasts, but their position at the very outset of the piece has to lend them some dramatic authority, for a great composer anyway, and so they become problematic as they proceed to infect the rest of the movement. Let's see how the seeds of conflict become problematic in Seinfeld. Here's Jerry bumping into an old college friend.
I got the alumni magazine. Whatever happened to your friend George? I noticed I never see his name in there.
Well, he's kind of modest.
He was always such a goof-off. I mean, did he ever get anywhere?
Sure.
Yeah? What field?
Marine biology.
George is a marine biologist?
Yeah, pretty damn good one, too.
I can't believe it. I would never have thought.
Yeah, he's specializing in whales. He's working on lowering the cholesterol level in whales.
And then Kramer enters.
Hey, you want these? I don't want them. What? I stink! I can't play! The ball is just sitting there, Jerry, and I can't hit it. I only hit one really good ball that went way out there.
Just like in Mozart and Haydn, these central issues continue to develop over the course of the episode as Kramer can't get rid of the sand from his failed golf outing, and George pretends to be a marine biologist to impress his college crush.
Well, what if she calls me? What am I supposed to say? Algae. Obviously plankton. I don't know what else I could tell you. I just got back from a trip to the Galapagos Islands. I was living with the turtles.
Meanwhile, our Mozart movement carries out the inherent conflicts in its opening material as it becomes saturated with deceptive resolutions and extreme dynamic contrasts. I wish I had time to point out each of these examples, but the dynamic highlights include crazy measures like this, where every beat gets a different dynamic. And I'll tell you that by my last count, I found 17 deceptive resolutions in the movement. So the way both of these motives keep recurring shows that they really are the central issues of the piece for Mozart. And this is confirmed by the way it ends. The release from the cycle comes when the two parallel plot lines or problems ultimately intersect in the most brilliant moments of the show and music alike. Here's what happens after George has to use his marine biology knowledge to save a beached whale.
And then, as I watched him struggling, I realized that something was obstructing its breathing. From where I was standing, I could see directly into the eye of the great fish.
Mammal.
Whatever.
Hey, what did you do next?
Well, then, from out of nowhere, a huge tidal wave lifted me, tossed me like a cork, and I found myself right on top of him, face to face with the blowhole. I could barely see from the waves crashing down upon me, but I knew something was there. So I reached my hand in, felt around, and pulled out the obstruction.
What is that, a Titleist? A hole in one, huh?
So it's brilliant because who could have seen that coming? But at the same time, it's the only way the episode could have ended. It's the perfect marriage of the two problems that set the episode in motion. Listen to the way Mozart does the same thing. That final deceptive resolution is so sweet and satisfying that you kind of have to chuckle. And then it triggers the last two bars in pianissimo, an exceptionally soft dynamic marking for Mozart. This union of deceptive resolution and dynamic extreme is the sort of course moment. It's at once clever and obvious, hilariously unexpected, but also exactly what had to happen in order to allow the movement to finish, as mandated by its opening conflict. Rather than Mozart squeezing his music into a pre-existing structure, the form of the movement is actually impelled by its initial material. Charles Rosen calls this a synthesis out of dramatic irregularity and large-scale symmetry. To me, it's this structural elegance that makes Mozart and Seinfeld so masterful and so fundamental. Seinfeld isn't plot-driven. It concentrates on the quotidian, not the melodramatic, and it feeds off of the potential energy in its larger structure. In the same way, Mozart's music doesn't seek to tell an epic story or express some larger-than-life emotion. But for both the show and the music, it's this classical restraint that ultimately allows us to connect with them on the deepest, most familiar level of all. In abstaining from grandiose expression, they actually express something much more fundamental and human. And this is the brilliant paradox of Mozart that I think my theory professor was alluding to when he said he wrote the music that everyone knew, but no one had written down. Mozart is at once scintillatingly fresh and deeply familiar, simple but not simplistic, and in the words of Scott Burnham, somehow both unerring and human, untouchable and touching. Thank you.